Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to this event. Those of you who spend a lot of time at AEI, which I hope is all of you, if you're not, you should come here more, you know that what defines our work is two core moral principles: human dignity and human potential. The universality of human dignity and the limitlessness of human potential is what drew AEI's scholars and staff to this place. And I think what gives our work the vigor that it does. Certainly, it's what inspires me to come here every day. We believe that while the system isn't perfect, the American free enterprise system is the key driver of these two moral pillars. Free enterprise brings meaningful work, earned success, and self-determination within reach for whole generations and societies for the very first time. It is, I believe, America's gift to the world, and it's the only system in history that's given billions of people the chance to pull themselves out of poverty. I suspect all of you in this room join me in being proud of that, but we have to do more. We have to do more to find people at the periphery of society that need the opportunity to build their lives. And that's not just more people in the developing world, that's more people in the United States, right here, right now. That's what brings us to today's event. With these values, there's really no better guest for us to welcome to AEI today than Carla Javits. Carla is the president and CEO of REDF, which is the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund. REDF is a pretty unique organization. It's actually a venture philanthropy that invests exclusively in social enterprises that focus on employment for vulnerable people. It's the only organization like it in the United States. They invest capital in enterprises that are dedicated to helping the poor, the vulnerable, marginalized people, people who've been in prison, people who've been homeless, the people that are simply considered by most people in mainstream society to be beyond help. Carla Javits and REDF show that that's not true, that those who are homeless, mentally ill, incarcerated, addicted, they can get on their feet, they can get to work, and that in point of fact, that they can be necessary to our society just as all of you in this audience are necessary, which brings dignity and it brings the full face of humanity. If you believe in the radical equality of human dignity, as we do at AEI, these are important principles. Since its founding 20 years ago, REDF has grown from a family foundation structure into a real pioneer and innovator in the nonprofit sector. To date, they have invested in 100 social enterprises and have employed 18,000 people from coast to coast. They're well on their way to their goal of employing 50,000 people, and I strongly suspect that will be just the beginning. Carla served before joining REDF as the national president and CEO of the Corporation for Supportive Housing. She's worked with the California Office of Legislative Analysis and the San Francisco Department of Social Services. She has a long and storied career in these areas, working to help struggling individuals create stability, earn their success, and have the upward mobility that should be the patrimony of every single American. It's our honor to welcome her here today and with the conversation with our very own Robert Doar. You know Robert, he's AEI's Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies. He has, with his own hands, built our poverty studies practice from the very ground up. We're proud of the work that he's done, and he had a lot of experience. Most of you know that before joining AEI, he serves as the Commission of New York City's Human Resources Administration, and I'd like to point out that in that role, he oversaw a 25% reduction in the welfare caseload and the transition of 500,000 welfare recipients back into the workforce. Truly a moral and important endeavor. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to bring you Carla Javits and Robert Doar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Arthur, very much. I really feel kind of surrounded by heroes here. I've got Carla, which I want to talk about in a minute, and Arthur, who is so inspirational and been such a driving force in an effort to get our country and all segments of our country, not just politicians in Washington, but everyone, to focus more on people in need and ways in which we can bring them into this great system we have in the United States and make them full participants in work and in upward mobility. So Arthur, it's a great honor to have you introduce us. And I also like this format. It gives us an opportunity to sort of banter back and forth, and I promise I won't ask too many tricky questions. And I do want to say, Carla, it really is an honor to have you here. I knew your work at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Homelessness was an issue that the city of New York struggled with, and you were a great partner, and your organization was a great partner in New York State. And then the work at REDF is again, as someone who's in the welfare system and is dealing with people coming in need, and who our challenge was to get them into employment, a partner like the organizations that you fund and support and inspire and guide is just so important, because in order to help someone work, you need an employer, and you need an employer that's willing to maybe go a little extra for that person in need. So on the other hand, I'd also, since I know a lot about what you do, and you know a lot about what you do, but not everybody does, and so I hope that we can do a little elementary work here and make sure that we're clear about what it is a social enterprise is and how it works. And so let's do that groundwork first. So just what is a social enterprise?
And it is a privilege and an honor to be here with you and with Arthur and with AEI and all of you. Thank you for being here today. And particularly Robert, I just wanted to say, a lot of people talk about these issues, but you've been in the arena fighting it out for a long time, and I really just respect and honor that, so thank you. So a social enterprise basically, first of all, is a business. It's just like a regular business. It sells good quality goods and services to the market. Somebody has to want to buy the goods and services that they sell. What is unique about social enterprises, though, is their social mission. They basically invest all the profits that they make in helping the individuals that they employ have a better life and really have a long-lasting, successful future of work. And essentially the way they do that is that they both provide a real wage-paid job to people who, most employers might be reluctant to hire because they have a history of homelessness, they might have been incarcerated, they might be young people who have grown up in a tough neighborhood and don't sort of demonstrate all the attributes that an employer is looking for. So these are companies that actually provide those individuals with a job, wage-paid employment, in a supportive setting where management is really about the success, investing in the success of those individuals and training them and building their skills, and where they can connect to the kinds of supports that they may need to deal with the things that have stood in their way as they've tried to get into the workforce.
So I'm the welfare administrator. Sitting across my desk is a young man who's just returned from some time in prison. High school education, maybe not. Had some issues with drug addiction in the past. And I've got a choice. I can refer you to the sort of traditional workforce development program, which I think you know a little bit about, or I could send you over to Rite Aid, or maybe the hospitality sector employment for maybe a start there, or I could send them to a social enterprise. Tell me about how those three are different.
Yeah, I mean, here's the distinction. First of all, the mainstream workforce system, as we know it, that's sort of paid for by the federal government. It's the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act governs it, the WIA system. Generally has not served the people that we're talking about, and even when they've tried to serve them, has not served them all that well. Why? Because basically that's a system that's set up so that if Carla lost her job that she'd had for 20 years in a factory, I would be retrained in a 3-month period at a community college, replaced in a job, and I'm off to the races. That is essentially, that's how all the success markers of that system are set up. If instead I'm a person who has been incarcerated, I grew up in a neighborhood where there weren't that many people working, not that many role models for work, I've never had a legitimate job, I'm not going to be successful in just getting retrained and immediately replaced.
You might not have done well in school in the past. Why would I do well in school now?
Exactly, yeah, really. And I'm struggling with some other issues just in terms of basic sort of demeanor and comportment. I'm not used to working in a regular work setting, and I'm not getting any support for that. I'm just getting basic skills retraining and move on and move up. A lot of the sort of the nonprofits and other groups that are also part of that system often are doing like a classroom experience to try to sort of brush up people's skills, or they might be helping me write my resume better, learn how to interview, things like that. But my problems may go a bit deeper than that. Again, I'm not really familiar with the norms of the workplace. I've not had a chance to really try that out. And so if I'm just in a classroom getting a little brush up, I'm not really going to deeply learn the skills that I need, the attributes that I need in order to be successful. And if you just send me to a mainstream employer at the front line, I mean, look, we all know, we've all had those jobs. I certainly have. Those are jobs that are not generally the most incredibly well managed of positions, where there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, and often people who haven't had a lot of work experience, they flounder in those jobs. So they may get the job, but then often, unfortunately, they lose the job.
Or even if they get it, not have the patience.
The employer doesn't have the patience for it. And in other situations, honestly, the employer is just reluctant to hire because it seems like a risk. Look, you have 10-year blank in your resume because you were homeless, or you've been in prison. Geez, I'm not going to cross that hurdle. I'm worried. It's too much of a risk. So having a real wage-paid job in a supportive environment that's building my skills, employers look at that and they say, I understand that. This person has successfully worked on the job. Their manager calls me and says they're ready. And, it's a much better equation for the mainstream employer.
And I just want to emphasize the one part about the wage-pays job. The workforce development system, someone goes off to, and while they're in it, they may not be getting paid. They may not be having
also true.
And what do folks want the most?
Right,
They want a paycheck.
Yeah.
So that's another advantage.
That's
it keeps
true.
them attached and engaged.
First
of all, what's success? And how are you doing in achieving success?
Yeah. Basically what we look at in terms of success is that people get employed and stay employed, and that more of the income that they have is from work rather than from public assistance, and that over time their incomes go up. I mean, those are kind of the main markers for us. And we did a very large-scale study with a very reputable firm called Mathematica. It's called the Mathematica Job Study. And we looked at the social enterprises in our portfolio in California, and we found that overall incomes went up 268%. That compared to a group of people who got those traditional workforce services, the people who got a job in social enterprise were 33% more likely to be working a full year later. That when they first got employed, about 3/4 of their income came from government, about 1/4 from the wages that they earned. After they got a job in social enterprise, that flipped, so that about 1/4 of their income came from other programs, and 3/4 of their income came from their own work effort. So these, and also, I would point out housing stability tripled, and we also looked at, what was the profile of the people that were getting employed by these social enterprises. And I think when you look at that, these results are even more profound. 1/4 of the people, 1 out of every 4 of the people who got employed, had never had a legitimate job before. And their average age wasn't young. It was, I think it was, 40s. So the success was
But these are enterprises. I'm gonna, before I get to sort of what REDF, they are enterprises, and so and I've talked to your grantees, and so someone who gets this more patient employer and this environment that comes with a paycheck but also a job, but who is not able to show up or comply. There are consequences, isn't that correct?
Yeah, there are, and each of the social enterprises sort of deals with this differently, but they are real businesses, and ultimately, I mean, it's quite challenging what they're doing because they're managing a workforce that they intentionally are trying to help move on and move out into mainstream employment. So to begin with, it's a challenging task. Each of the enterprises deals with it slightly differently, but there are definitely consequences when you're not, behaving as you might expect in a normal work environment, or you don't show up, or you're late all the time. Generally, what they're looking for, you may get fired. You may not, continue to have that job. Often they'll take another look at you because perhaps, some of your problems have gotten in your way. you haven't shown up, but then you can come back and they'll give you another try.
And give me the landscape of REDF. You are not a direct operator. You are a facilitator and guider and funder. Tell me that role versus the role, and how many are you now funding, and what did you fund 5 years ago?
Right. So REDF, we call ourselves a venture philanthropy organization, and our primary role is to invest essentially equity into these companies so that they can grow and so that they can have greater impact. We provide very deep advisory services, your typical business advisory services, whether it be looking at the market or new lines of business or your brand or whatever that may be. We connect these social enterprises to one another because they don't know each other, and it hasn't traditionally been sort of a sector, if you will. And so we connect them to each other, which is also very powerful. They can do business and learn from one another. We cultivate their leadership, and then, as I just said, we measure their impact. And the point of measuring the impact is both to make a convincing case to funders and policymakers and investors that this is worth doing, but it's also, frankly, to learn what's working, what's not working, and help them be more successful. REDF started 20 years ago. We were essentially a family foundation, quite small, in California. We worked with a few, small groups. We learned the hard way, what worked, what didn't. We were able to take a lot of risk. Some of the investments didn't work out. We probably learned the most from those that didn't work out as well. But we grew slowly over time. We learned more what really did work. We got better at identifying which companies would succeed and which wouldn't, and at providing these kinds of advisory services. If you looked at us in 2015, we were essentially providing the money and the advice to about 7 social enterprises just in California. If you looked at us in 2016, we provided assistance to 65 social enterprises in 18 states. So we've intentionally set out on a plan now to scale up. And
from
really,
Long Island to the Redwood Forest?
From Long Island to the Redwood Forest. And we've set a goal of 50,000 people employed by 2020. And we're really trying to cultivate an industry that's sustainable and, frankly, that's going to be able to employ, I think, hundreds of thousands of people over time.
And give us some examples of the products and services they provide to their customers.
Yeah, these companies are very entrepreneurial, and they exist in all different, markets, so they do all kinds of different things. All of them have to be employing large numbers of people with relatively, introductory skill sets. So they do everything from, ballpark concessions to even airplane manufacturing, from janitorial services to electronic waste, recycling, beautification projects, a very wide array of products and services.
And they compete with other businesses in their sectors and collaborate with other businesses?
They do. They both compete and collaborate. The entrepreneurs who run these social enterprises are actually have to be quite extraordinary, because we're asking them to run a successful business. And at the same time, we're asking them to train a workforce that probably has not had a lot of experience, and to help their best employees move on to another company after they've been there. So we're really looking for top-notch entrepreneurs, essentially, to balance those two missions. And
I'm sort of dying for a favorite or one.
Yeah.
Can you give us one? Located in some place or will you get in trouble?
Yeah, exactly. My favorite children. There are many. I wanted to mention maybe a couple of them that I think just kind of illustrate different points. One area that's really good for this kind of work is both food service and also food products and things like that. There's a wonderful entity up in Seattle, which I urge you to go visit, that's called Fair Start. They run a full-service restaurant, excellent. I've eaten there, really outstanding. They run a catering company and a couple of cafes. They employ large numbers of very disadvantaged people. Many of them have been homeless. They train them in the food services business, and then they help them move on into the industry. They have a very high level of success. Interesting thing about them is that they recently cut a deal with Amazon. Amazon's a huge employer up in Seattle. They've got a
huge employer.
Yeah, huge employer all over the country. They've got a large, beautiful campus up in Seattle, and they just built a big new building, and they're going to have 5 food service concerns in that building for their employees, and they've hired Fair Start to run all of them, which is going to allow Fair Start to double the number of people employed and to double their revenue. And you asked earlier sort of the competition collaboration. This is a great example of the collaboration. Yeah. What companies can do and are doing is to buy products and services from the social enterprises. That allows them to grow and and serve more people. And then once they train people, the private sector is also, and we're doing this in many places, wants to hire the individuals that are trained and bring them in, and that's how we collaborate with them.
Now, I'm going to ask you kind of a technical, welfare administrator, recovering bureaucrat question, and I'm sorry about that. But when you're trying to target your help to people who are particularly in need, sometimes do the social enterprises have to sort of say, well, in order to be hired into our program, you need to have X, Y, or Z difficulty that you've had, or how do you make sure you're serving those who are the most in need, or not? What do you do about that?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful question, and I want to give kind of two different answers to it. One is, interestingly, unlike many public programs that get tripped up in these sorts of things, oh, well, you didn't meet, this exact criteria, and so, no, sorry, we can't serve you. Yeah. Social enterprise has really grown up from the business community and from the private sector. It wasn't initiated by the government, and so all of those kind of restrictions that sometimes make it very difficult for programs to actually function effectively really have not been the kind of the governing issue for these social enterprises. Now, on the other hand, they do want to target. They want to affirmatively target. And so they're all quite different, but they're careful about working with other entities, other organizations in their community. It might be the public systems, it might be other nonprofits that are going to channel the right people into them. And we wanted to be sure that this was in fact the case, because you could easily say, well, we're doing a great job, but we're just creaming off the best people who would have gotten somewhere anyway. So we really did take this hard look at who was coming in the door. A quarter had never had a job, 70% had been convicted of a crime before they got a job in a social enterprise, and 85% were living in unstable housing before they got a job in a social enterprise. So we know, we're getting where we need to be. That said, the enterprises are all different. Some of them employ people who have been homeless. Some of them employ young people who have grown up in tough circumstances and are not in school. Some of them intentionally employ people coming out of incarceration. There's an interesting one I wanted to mention with an example called ROCA that's run by just a visionary leader, Molly Baldwin, who started it. And they really are about employing the gang-involved youth who have been, young adults who have been incarcerated, who are at the highest risk of reincarceration. And they'll go to court to find those people. They'll go bang on their doors, and they tell stories about this, trying to get them to come in and get the job. And the person will say, go away, I never want to talk to you. And they go back, and they go back, and they go back. So they very actively recruit and solicit. Others are more, you have to apply and get a job. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, then I want to open it up to the audience. But one has to do with men. Our colleague Nick Eberstadt wrote a really compelling book about men being out of work, 7 million men who are out of the labor force, not looking for work. Princeton scholars Angus Deaton and Ann Case have written about a category of population that are just completely disconnected. And Harry Holzer and I and Brent Orrell did a paper on men out of work as well. Just speaking about them, what is the breakdown, men, women, in these social enterprises, and are you seeing anything in that dynamic that you want to share with us?
I mean, it is more heavily, it's about 3/4 men, about 1/4 women. We are, interestingly, there are some social enterprises that target women explicitly, many of whom have either been incarcerated, involved in other, very abusive, traumatic situations and things like that. But about 3/4 are men. And I guess what I would say is, I think that we've accepted that there are a large number of people, millions of people in our society who can't work and won't work. And in fact, that's not the case. I mean, if we have learned anything from the 20 years of work at REDF, it is that there are so many people who we write off essentially as not being capable of being integrated into the workforce, who are fully capable of work, in fact, really want to work, are eager to work, but they don't see any pathway in because they haven't been exposed to the kind of basic skills they need in order to be successful. And when an employer looks at their record and who they've been, they're just reluctant to hire them because it seems like too high of a risk. And there's no, kind of, if you will, farm team or training ground where people can kind of get their act together in a real work situation and then move on. But the eagerness and the desire is there. The other thing I just wanted to mention is we tend to focus very heavily in the welfare system, especially on women who have children. And many people ask us, what about the people who you're employing? Do they have children? And what about the men? Many of the men have children, but they're what we call non-custodial parents. They're parents who aren't involved in their children's lives. Why? Because in many cases, they want to be interacting with their children when their children can respect them and when they have the dignity of being a working person. And they haven't had that chance, and so they're reluctant to be involved with their children. And what we see over and over again is once they do have a job, they reconnect and they become much more involved in their children's lives. And I think this is really part of a two-generation strategy that allows them to be involved with their families, to help their spouse, and to really cultivate the lives of their children.
So upstairs we were talking about, I know you read the newspapers, so do I, and the unemployment rate is really low, and I don't know, a lot of employers are having trouble finding workers. Isn't there just a self-interest in this for the American business community that if they can't find workers, they're going to need to get some workers from the people that you serve? Isn't that the downstream benefit not only to them but to our economy as a whole?
Yeah, it definitely is. And we see that in the employers we speak with who need well-trained frontline workers, that they have a tough time finding people who are well prepared for those positions. And thus, they suffer from high levels of turnover, and they just kind of write that off as a cost of doing business. But it's very unsatisfactory, and I think they're looking for solutions to that problem.
So far, in very good American Enterprise Institute way, we have stayed away from mentioning anything about the federal government and funding, and because you're doing this on your own, maybe, and that's great. We love that, but there is a connection to the government. And tell us a little bit about what these enterprises or your program gets or has gotten in support from the government, and what's the status of that?
Yeah, I mean, we're working with the government in a number of different ways. As I said, social enterprises really grew up from the community, from the private sector, frankly with frustration, with a lot of the existing public programs. But that said, now that we're trying to scale this up and make it, sort of a massive force that can really address the problem at scale, we know that we need a partnership, and so we deliberately wanted to begin to influence the government so that it would invest in something that we could see worked and had results, and frankly, that could bring in a lot of the revenue so that ongoing the government didn't have to constantly pay for it, that there was actually revenue that was earned by the companies that offset the cost of government. So we thought we had a very powerful case to make, and in fact we looked at the social return on investment of these companies, and we found for every dollar a social enterprise spends, there's $2.23 of benefit. I could unpack that. So with that, we actually went into a big program of the federal government Congress had authorized called the Social Innovation Fund. It is a terrific program. It essentially provides funding to intermediaries, venture philanthropies like ours, with the intention of scaling up evidence-based best practices at the community level. And it combines both some resources to scale up with a real focus on evidence. So that it was in partnership with the Social Innovation Fund that we did that big study that generated all that great data and those great results. They invested in REDF and the great thing about that program was they required almost a 3-to-1 private sector cash match, which we made, through raising other funds from the private sector, as well as the revenue earned by these companies, which matched it, which was great. The Social Innovation Fund, all told, I think has leveraged something like $650 million of private sector funds for all the things that they've done. So they invested early in us. We did the data. We did the work in California. We expanded there. And with that, they were so pleased with it that they decided to reinvest and help us essentially with the direct funding, the equity, if you will, that we provide to these social enterprises to help them grow and scale and be more effective. And then we embedded within that another evaluation to kind of take the level of data up a notch. Under this recent round, they were intending to give us 5 years of funding, a total of $17.5 million. They gave us 7, and with that, we've gone out nationally. We have this big portfolio. We're doing the work. We've put thousands of people to work. But unfortunately, in this most recent budget deal, the Congress made a decision not to fund the Social Innovation Fund. And I think it's one of the most short-sighted decisions. Even though it's a very small program, I think the power and the impact of it in building the evidence base and the effectiveness of community programs that address these very crucial needs just can't be overstated. So,
so the challenge, it's a problem.
Yeah.
The enterprises will go forward,
yeah.
And you have 2 ways to fill the gap. One is you fight back and get the funding restored, and the other is you raise it.
We raise it privately. I mean, yes, I think and so we're very much interested, and frankly, the private sector is quite interested in this model. I think we can understand why. There is another element to this which is exciting, which is that at the local level and at the state level, actually some of the public sector programs, the government programs, are getting more interested in partnering because they see the effectiveness. We have a wonderful example in San Diego of a creative, innovative workforce board that decided, this is the future for workforce development for this population, and they've invested in an accelerator to try to grow social enterprise locally. In Los Angeles, we're in a partnership with the workforce system, which is providing some of the funds for training of the individuals when they're in the social enterprise. So we're beginning to have some inroads at the state and local level, and I hope we have more, because I think it's really time for these public systems to be supporting models like this that work.
Okay, so we're going to take questions from the internet. So if you go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter the code AEI event, one word, you can ask questions. Those of you who are out in the whatever world you are out in, and then I've got some already. So, and I want to ask this first one because it's a very brass tacks question. If you were someone who wanted to start a social enterprise, what would be the first steps to take?
Yes, fantastic question, and I'm so glad because this is something I didn't get to talk about. When REDF first began, most of the enterprises that we found were startups. They were little tiny companies. People were just trying to figure this out. This was the early days, 20 years ago. So for many years, we were working with smaller companies that were just in the startup phase. And we learned a lot from that. So we've synthesized everything we learned, and we've put it up on a special platform. I urge you all to get on it. It's called REDF Workshop, one word, redfworkshop.org. You can sign up there to become part of our community, and there's a tool suite there, outstanding tool suite, that provides you with essentially business planning tools so you can get started in thinking about how would your social enterprise really work. And then there's also, you join essentially a network of other social enterprises around the country, and we facilitate introductions between you, maybe you want to start a landscape company that employs young people who have struggled. We'll introduce you to another one over here on the other side of the country. And the groups have found this just extraordinary value because they can learn from others who have done what they've done before. I just did also want to mention, we also have an accelerator that we're running nationally. We're having our last group is meeting here over these next few days, and we're going to reopen that. So organizations that have started a social enterprise but are under $1 million in revenue can apply, and we're picking 18 a year to participate in sort of a boot camp style training to help them really get up to speed and be able to accelerate the growth and the effectiveness of their enterprise.
So there's another question here that I think is a very good one concerning particular barriers for people who are in need of employment. And one is mental health issues, and the other is housing.
Yeah.
And can you give us a sense of how a social enterprise addresses either one of those or both of those two issues? How would they help to overcome those?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably important to say here, first of all, many social enterprises are a branch of a larger nonprofit. And in some cases, they're organizations that themselves provide housing. So they provide housing over here on this side, but then they realized, okay, gee, we got people housed, now they need a job. So let's start a business over here so that people are employed. So they themselves can, to some extent make those connections. They're also generally embedded in a larger community, and they do foster those connections with other entities to try to help the people that they employ get housing or get services. And that is also true, I think, the whole issue of kind of behavioral care, if you will, mental health and addiction are obviously big issues. And many people are struggling with them. And so almost all of these companies either connect their employees to mental health or substance abuse treatment services if they need them, or they actually embed what they call trauma-informed practices into both the way they manage their workforce and into the services that they provide. So they sort of recognize that the people that they're employing may be struggling with mental health or addiction issues, and they educate their management and their service team to understand those issues and try to address them in the...
So their collaboration with government or other service providers is not only from the Social Intervention Fund, it's at the local level with maybe EITC preparation or other kinds of public health insurance.
Yes.
That exists as well.
Yes, it may be financial literacy, it may be housing, yes, absolutely. And I think, maybe it's important, this would be a good moment to say this. So what is the business model here? We haven't really talked about that. Yeah. The basic business model is what we've seen, sort of looking over all these enterprises, that they can cover, and this is what we're aiming for, virtually all of what you would think of as business costs with the revenue that they earn from the sale of products and services. So that's, wages, benefits, the basic costs of doing the work. Many of them need to raise some money and or partner with the public systems for the resources for the extra supports that are provided to these individuals, right? It's hard to cover the costs of mental health services or job placement services through business revenue. And we don't want to drown a successful business and cause them to overprice their services by, inflating what are normal business costs, nor do we want them to hide behind the need to cover those costs as a business that's not doing as well. Mm-hmm. So we're really aiming to cover those business costs. Some of the companies are able, frankly, to earn enough that they can also cover the support services, but some need to continue to rely on some public resources and fundraising to cover those service costs.
Okay, I want to see if there are any questions from the audience, and we have one right here in the front row.
Hi, I'm Troy Bergman with the National Association of Workforce Boards.
Great.
And I'm one of those people. If you wouldn't mind. Oh, sorry. I'm one of those people who doesn't think that government is the problem. It may not be the whole answer, but it can help. Sure. And you answered one of my questions by saying that a couple of your programs are involved with workforce development boards. I was also going to ask about the work opportunities tax credit. For those of you who aren't into government ease, it's a credit that a tax credit companies can get for employing hard to serve people. And I wanted to suggest that we might talk afterwards, because I think I can think of ways where you can educate more of the workforce development boards about how they can engage successfully with enterprises.
Yeah, we would really welcome that opportunity. And you know, I believe government should be, can be, must be a important partner if this is going to scale up. I mean, there's no question. I just think that you know, it requires some shifting in the way they've been thinking. You know, in a funny way, social enterprise, and that's why these forums are so important, it's a little bit neither fish nor fowl. And it has that problem. People, is it a business or is it a program, or, you know, and so different entities have a tough time wrapping their heads around how to really work with this, even though it's quite effective and it really, you know, kind of fills that missing puzzle piece between sort of training, if you will, and the business community. So I would welcome that. And, you know, we would love to be leveraging more the tax credits and other advantages that are available.
Tamar? Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm glad you answered the question about the business model. That's what I've been itching to ask all along. But the one thing I don't understand is, so do many of them ever become self-sustaining, or are we really envisioning that for the long haul, most of them will need either some philanthropic help or some government help? And the other question is about the relationship with the next stage of hiring. What do you know about how many do eventually place people elsewhere? What kinds of regular businesses hire? Is that a hard lift? You know, if I'm running my little, you know, my food service thing in a for-profit food service company in Seattle, am I going to be hesitant to hire your people even after they've had a job? What happens then?
Yeah, I mean, on the first question around sustainability, what we've seen is that as these companies scale up, some of them, in fact, are able to generate significant revenue and can really fully cover their costs. I guess, you know, it's interesting, in a social entrepreneurship or business environment, we're often challenged around this, you know, sort of hybrid business model. And I guess I would say, having started as Robert spent time on the government side, on the public sector side, and now sort of in philanthropy, if you will, the equation here is so good. You're essentially covering 80% of your costs through earned revenue that the government and philanthropy doesn't have to pay. That's why you get a $2.23 ROI. And so, you know, that support services, mental health services, might have to be covered by some other source, seems to me an incredibly good deal for taxpayers, from a taxpayer perspective, et cetera. And are we pushing the businesses to cover as much of their costs as possible through revenue? Of course. And I think many of them would be able to do that. But I think an equation where you're having some of the costs subsidized is something that is, frankly, sustainable, because, you know, there's some level of resources that will be coming in. In terms of placement into mainstream employment, which is a great question, the evaluation that we're just about to fire up is going to look really hard at this question, because in the last evaluation, we just didn't separate the people who were employed by a social enterprise. We looked out a year, but we didn't totally sort out who was getting the next step job somewhere else and who was in social enterprise. Everybody wants the answer to that question. So this time, we are going to look much more carefully at who leaves the social enterprise. But that said, we do have statistics from, you know, many of the entities that we work for that are extremely positive on outplacement. The ROCA that I mentioned, of the people who complete and get 60 days in a row, which is their completion of work in a social enterprise, of those people, I think the statistic is 90% are employed. I believe it's 6 months later. You know, so there are statistics in many of the individual companies about that. I also would. No, so that I was just going to mention, so the other really interesting thing we've been doing on two fronts is in Los Angeles, for example, if you're interested, it's called the Los Angeles Regional Initiative for Social Enterprise. It's actually a partnership with the city there. And it's a partnership with the business community. And we have a number of businesses, Whole Foods, and large nonprofits, regular mainstream companies that are hiring, Tender Greens, some others, from social enterprise and have made an agreement, basically a pact. If people are prepared to a certain level, they'll look at them and they'll employ them. So we're trying to sort of foster those private-public partnerships. And then we're also going to individual companies, and we have slowly been able to create relationships with individual companies, frankly, that are not doing this because sure, they want to be do-gooders, but they're looking for well-prepared, well-trained frontline workers who are going to be loyal, work hard, and they found that this is an incredibly productive source of those employees. So they're eager, frankly, for solutions like this. And I think, our challenge is to make this as seamless and large scale as possible, so that more and more companies can really see how well it.
But there's the benefit of the person who has the job in the social enterprise, and a typical wage would be
in the social enterprise. It's definitely at minimum, sometimes above.
Okay. And then there's the benefit of the placement afterwards. Is there a time limit? Do you prescribe to your enterprises that we'd rather your employees were there for no longer than a certain period, or do you leave that up to them?
Again, so ungovernment-like. We just kind of rely on them to figure out what works best. And what we've seen, we've learned, just absorbing from the field what does work best, is that they range between 3 months and 2 years in general. Okay. And that the amount of time really does depend on the target population, if you will, that's being served.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Ms. Javits. My name is Todd Wiggins. I want to congratulate you on this. Is very inspiring what you have to offer. But I wanted to know what is the political ramifications, because over the last two presidential campaigns, I think the general number as far as overall national unemployment has been around somewhere between 7 to 9%. And so it seems like if it goes under, then it's favorable for the incumbent or the candidate to be. But if it goes around 9 to 10%, then it's perceived as being very egregious situation. So where is the percentage of these people, and how does that fit in the general Richter scale of effectiveness as far as political ramifications are concerned?
Yeah, on that specific, I really appreciate the question. Here's what I would say. Sadly, and I think your data probably on the 7 million or so shows this, the people we're talking about are often not even included in national figures about unemployment. These are where you really see these numbers are in the area that other people have been looking at, which is workforce participation rates. Right. What percentage of working age adults in the United States work? That's a different measure than unemployment, which generally is just counting people who have been in the workforce and are actively looking for work. A lot of these people are so discouraged, they're not even looking for work, they haven't been in the workforce, so they're not even counted in those statistics. And yet, they are on a lot of public programs forever, or cycling through the prisons and, unfortunately, homelessness and other things. And so we are at a point where we have I believe, the highest levels of not participating, non-workforce participation that we've had in many, many years in this country. There are more people not participating in the workforce, even though they're of working age. Some people say it's demographics and there's other issues that pour into that, and that's true. But even setting that aside, there's just a lot of very discouraged people who are not in the workforce. And so this is really about, if you want to put it in a political context, I think our current president spoke about the forgotten Americans. I think these are a lot of people who, are just, they're not even counted in a meaningful way.
Yeah, the labor force participation among some folks in this building and in Washington is all we talk about. and the extent to which male prime-aged labor force participation is now 88%, and among those with a high school education or less, it's only 83%, when 25 years ago it was 97%. That's a big problem. And when unemployment drops to the extent that it has, and the job openings are out there looking for workers, there is a potential that if we don't help these folks into the mainstream labor market, our businesses are really going to suffer because they just won't be able to find workers. So we have a question right here, and then I've got one last comment, and then I think we may be done.
Thank you.
Is that all right with you?
My name is Evan Davies. I'm an independent consultant. You mentioned that REDF learned some of its greatest lessons from some of the failures that took place. Could you give us a couple of examples of enterprises that tried to do things that kind of failed spectacularly?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, I think the best way to give you that information is less, sort of the specific companies, but I would generically, here were the problems. First of all, not every nonprofit should be running a business. The management is not capable of running a business. The culture of the organization is not about running a business. It's about running a program, a service program. By nature, a service organization is about empathy and compassion for the individual person and trying to make life work for them, not necessarily firing them if they don't show up on the job, right? And so there was a cultural misfit in some cases, so that the organization was just not capable, or the entrepreneur in some cases was not capable of just running a business. And then in other cases, unfortunately, there was a selection of a business type that neither employed a lot of frontline people, nor did it really have a market niche so that it could earn the revenue that it needed in order to stay alive, either because there was too much other competition or because nobody wanted to buy the goods and services that were being sold. So there were a lot of excitement about ideas that just were not solid businesses, or it was not a culture fit with the organization. So we learned to select for entrepreneurs and organizations that had the kind of leadership that was dedicated to and could run a business. And we really learned the hard way. We're sort of called balloon poppers, and to some extent, that just because a member of your board gave you a free space somewhere and you think it's a great idea to start a business in there, it may not be. It may not be a good location, and the kind of business you're thinking about may not employ a lot of people, may not earn revenue. So really trying to get some discipline around that has, I think, gone a long way to improving the sector and leading to the area where we are now, which is so many of these are more successful and are able to actually have the impact that we want to see.
So, Carla, it's been very great to have you. You are clearly one of the great leaders in this field of helping people in need in the country, and you have been for a long time. And it's not an accident. I mean, it's not. We haven't mentioned your heritage, your legacy. Senator Javits is from New York, as am I, so we knew him back then. And I wanted to show you something on the screen. This is a mural that appears in Bedford-Stuyvesant Plaza in the central Brooklyn at the Restoration Complex. And the Restoration Complex was started by Robert Kennedy, the guy in the middle there. And it is really was the first community development corporation started. The man on the far right is Senator Javits. Elsie Richardson is the woman between him and Senator Kennedy. The person to the left of Senator Kennedy is John Doar, who I'm related to. And then there's Judge Jones on the far left and Benno Schmidt on the very far left. And it was a great example of public-private effort to bring back a community that in 1969, when this group of people got together, really was struggling in desperate shape. And it's not like that anymore, and small efforts, painstakingly made over a long period of time, as Carla's doing, do pay off in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great.
I'm sorry you don't mind
Thank you
when I
so
did
much.
that.
That's beautiful.
Is that okay?
Thank you.